I'm going to need to see those boarding passes again. And this time I want to see some additional identification that proves you actually purchased first-class tickets." Patricia Holloway's voice carried that particular blend of authority and suspicion that flight attendants reserve for passengers they believe don't belong. The sound of 2 boarding passes being placed on the leather armrest wasn't the soft whisper you'd expect. It was deliberate. Dr. Amara Chen's fingers remained steady as she set down the documents, her NASA contractor badge visible for just a moment before sliding back into her jacket pocket. Beside her, Dr. Kaya Chen simply looked up from her legal brief, pen still poised over a margin note about civil rights precedent. What Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in less than 12 hours, one of these women would be sitting across from her airline's legal team, not as a passenger, but as the expert witness who could cost them everything. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt like every eye was measuring whether you deserved to be there? Like your presence alone was somehow a mistake that needed correcting? Because what happened on Delta Flight 1247 from Atlanta to San Francisco on that Monday morning was exactly that, and so much more. If you've ever felt invisible in spaces where you should matter most, you'll want to hear every word of what comes next. Stories like this one don't make the evening news, but they should. Now, let's go back to where this really began. The first-class cabin of Flight 1247 hummed with the quiet efficiency of a Monday morning departure. Leather seats in neat rows of 2, each passenger settling into their own bubble of expensive comfort. The Chen sisters had boarded early, using Amara's frequent flyer status earned through years of traveling between NASA facilities and contractor sites across the country. Dr. Amara Chen, 34, had spent the weekend in Atlanta consulting on a propulsion system that would eventually carry the first woman to the lunar surface. Her briefcase contained classified technical drawings that 3 different government agencies had signed off on. Her sister, Dr. Kaya Chen, 34 minutes younger according to family legend, carried briefcases of her own legal documents for a federal appeals case she'd be hearing arguments for on Thursday. They were flying to San Francisco not for work, but for something far more personal. Their father's memorial service was set for Tuesday evening, a gathering of family and the academic colleagues who had known Dr. James Chen during his 40-year career as a biochemistry professor at UC Berkeley. Amara had her laptop open, reviewing trajectory calculations that would help determine launch windows for the next lunar mission. Kaya was annotating a brief on constitutional law, her fountain pen moving in precise strokes across the margins. Neither woman was paying attention to the other passengers boarding around them, lost in work that demanded their complete focus. That's when Patricia Holloway approached their row. At 51, Patricia had worked for the airline longer than some of her colleagues had been alive. 22 years of service, most of it in economy class until her recent promotion to first-class purser. The promotion had come after what the airline diplomatically called a passenger relations incident in the back of the plane, an incident that had resulted in a formal complaint, a required sensitivity training course, and a transfer to the front cabin where management hoped her attention to detail would be better appreciated. Patricia prided herself on running a tight cabin, every passenger properly seated, every carry-on bag in its designated space, every service protocol followed to the letter. She had built her career on being thorough, on catching the mistakes that other flight attendants might miss. In her view, the first-class cabin was a premium space that required premium attention to detail. "Excuse me, ladies." Patricia's voice had that practiced flight attendant brightness, but there was something underneath it. "I need to verify your boarding passes." Amara looked up from her laptop screen, trajectory calculations still filling her vision. "I'm sorry." "Your boarding passes. I need to see them." Patricia's smile remained fixed, but her eyes had already moved to the documents she expected them to produce. Kaya reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew her boarding pass, the same boarding pass she'd shown at security, at the gate, and to the flight attendant who had welcomed her aboard just minutes earlier. Amara did the same, closing her laptop to give the request her full attention. Patricia examined the documents with unusual care, holding them up to the cabin light, checking the seat numbers against the row markers, comparing the names to some internal standard that only she seemed to understand. "These look fine," she said finally, but she didn't hand them back immediately. "Are you traveling on company accounts?" The question hung in the air. Around them, other first-class passengers were settling into their seats, pulling out phones and tablets, accepting pre-departure beverages from other flight attendants. No one else was being asked about their company accounts or having their boarding passes subjected to this level of scrutiny. "Personal travel," Kaya said simply. Her voice carried the measured tone she used in courtrooms, neutral and factual. Patricia nodded but didn't move away from their row. "And you're both flying to San Francisco today?" Amara's fingers paused on her laptop keyboard. The question was so obvious as to be absurd. They were sitting on a plane to San Francisco, with boarding passes to San Francisco, but something about Patricia's tone suggested this wasn't really about their destination. "Yes," Amara said, "we are." What happened next would be captured on Marcus Webb's phone camera from seat 3F, though he didn't know it yet. Marcus, 67 years old, retired from teaching high school history in Birmingham, was traveling to visit his daughter in San Jose. He had never posted a video on social media, barely understood how Instagram worked, and generally avoided getting involved in other people's business. But something about the interaction he was witnessing made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't immediately name. Patricia finally handed back the boarding passes, but her body language suggested the interaction wasn't over. She straightened up, smoothing her uniform jacket, and surveyed the cabin with the expression of someone who had found a problem that needed solving. "I'll be back in just a moment," she told the sisters. "I need to check something with the gate." As Patricia walked toward the front of the cabin, Marcus Webb pulled out his phone. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Maybe it was the teacher in him, trained to document problems before they escalated. Maybe it was something simpler, the recognition of a situation that felt wrong in a way that would be hard to explain later without evidence. He pressed record just as Patricia returned, now accompanied by Kevin Marsh, the lead flight attendant who had been preparing the galley for departure. The twins hadn't noticed Marcus's camera. They were focused on Patricia, who was walking back toward their row with a different kind of purpose in her step. Amara had reopened her laptop, but her attention was divided now. Kaya had set down her pen and was watching the approaching flight attendants with the careful attention she usually reserved for oral arguments. "Ladies," Patricia said, her voice carrying more authority now that she had backup, "I'm going to need to see those boarding passes one more time." This morning, Kaya had been at her desk by 5:30, reviewing depositions in the ambient glow of her computer monitor, while downtown Atlanta still slept. The Meridian and Associates logo gleamed from the letterhead scattered across her mahogany workspace. Briefs for the healthcare discrimination case that had consumed her last 6 months, a motion to dismiss that needed filing by noon, and the quarterly partnership review documents she'd been avoiding for 3 days. Her coffee was still steaming when the building's security guard, James, knocked on her door frame. He'd worked the early shift for 8 years, knew which attorneys came in before dawn and which ones stumbled in closer to 10. With Kaya, it was always before 6. "Morning, counselor," he said, setting down a small paper bag. "Picked up those almond croissants from the place on Peachtree. Figured you might forget breakfast again." She looked up from her screen, glasses reflecting the harsh white of legal documents. "You didn't have to do that, James. How much do I owe you?" He waved her off, the same gesture he'd made dozens of times before. "Just don't work through lunch again. My wife says you're too skinny." After he left, Kaya ate slowly, mechanically, while scanning through case precedents. The partnership review sat unopened. She'd made senior associate 2 years ago, but the promotion to partner seemed to recede further each month, always contingent on one more successful case, one more billing hour milestone, one more perfect performance review. At 31, she was the youngest black woman in the firm's litigation department, and she felt the weight of that distinction in every interaction, every meeting where she was the only face that looked like hers. Her phone buzzed, a text from Amara, "Flight's at 2, I'll pick you up at noon. Please tell me you're not planning to work the entire weekend." Kaya glanced at the stack of papers, then at the clock. She had 7 hours before they needed to leave for the airport. 7 hours to make a meaningful dent in the healthcare case, to prepare for Monday's hearing, to review the partnership documents that would determine whether the next 2 years of 80-hour weeks had been worth it. She typed back, "Just finishing up some things. See you at noon." The lie came easily. She wouldn't be finishing anything. She'd be transferring files to her laptop, packing documents into her carry-on, turning a weekend sister trip into another working weekend. It's what she always did. It's what successful associates were supposed to do. At 10:15, her assistant Patricia brought in 3 new client files and a stack of correspondence that needed responses before end of business. At 11:30, opposing counsel called to discuss a settlement conference that might avoid months of depositions. At 11:55, Kaya was still at her desk, laptop bag open, feeding documents into it like kindling. The partnership review envelope sat where James had left it, next to the empty pastry bag. She picked it up, ran her thumb along the sealed edge, then dropped it into her briefcase unopened. "Maybe I'll read it on the plane," she said to her empty office, knowing she wouldn't. 3 miles away, Amara was having her own conversation with avoidance. The gallery space on Miami Circle hummed with the controlled chaos of an exhibition installation. Her photography series, Invisible Histories, was opening the following Friday, and nothing was ready. 27 large-format prints documenting forgotten sites of Black history throughout the South, each one requiring precise positioning, specific lighting, explanatory text that she'd rewritten 12 times. Her assistant, David, a recent SCAD graduate with endless enthusiasm and questionable spatial reasoning, was holding one end of a photograph that spanned nearly 4 feet. The image showed the remains of a freedmen's school in rural Georgia, abandoned walls almost lost in kudzu and shadow. "Higher on the left," Amara directed, squinting at the piece from across the room. "No, too much, down about an inch." They'd been adjusting this same photograph for 20 minutes. She knew it wasn't really about the positioning. It was about the review that had run in Art Forum the previous week, the one that praised her competent documentation and earnest social messaging in language that felt like being patted on the head by someone who thought they were being kind. David secured the final mounting bracket and stepped back. "I think that's it. This series is really powerful, Amara. People are going to see things they've never seen before." She nodded, but the words felt hollow. Powerful, important, necessary. The same descriptors that followed Black artists whose work engaged with history and trauma, as if that's all they were expected to create. She'd spent 3 years on these photographs, driving thousands of miles through small towns, gaining the trust of communities that had learned to be wary of outsiders with cameras. The work mattered to her in ways that went beyond critical reception or gallery sales. But she was tired of being the artist who documented pain, who made beautiful images of ugly histories, who was expected to be grateful for reviews that called her work important, while reserving words like brilliant and innovative for artists who didn't carry the weight of representation with every frame they shot. Her phone rang, Kaya's name on the screen. "Please tell me you're not still at the office," Amara said without preamble. "I'm leaving in 5 minutes. Are you ready?" Amara looked around the gallery. Half the prints were hung, The lighting was wrong for at least 6 pieces, and the opening statement she'd written for the exhibition catalog was still a rambling mess saved as a draft in her email. Define ready. Amara. I'm ready. I'll pick you up at your building. After hanging up, she spent another 10 minutes giving David instructions that could have waited until Monday, adjusting pieces that didn't need adjusting, avoiding the moment when she would have to stop working and start being a person who took vacations, who had weekends, who could visit her childhood friend in San Francisco without turning it into a networking opportunity or a research trip. The flight to San Francisco was supposed to be 3 hours of forced rest. No internet, no phone calls, no crisis that required immediate attention. Just her and Kaya, like when they were kids sharing a bedroom during sleepovers, talking about everything and nothing until their mothers told them to go to sleep. She locked the gallery door behind her and walked toward her car, already mentally composing the email she'd send David from the airport with additional instructions she'd forgotten to mention. It's just 3 days, she said aloud, as if saying it would make it feel true. Patricia Chen had been working for Delta for 11 years, long enough to remember when airline travel felt like an occasion, when passengers dressed up for flights and treated airline staff with something approaching respect. Now, she spent most of her shifts managing passengers who boarded planes in pajamas, who treated first-class service like an entitlement rather than a privilege, who seemed to think that buying an expensive ticket gave them license to behave however they pleased. She was adjusting her uniform jacket in the crew bathroom at Hartsfield-Jackson, checking her appearance in the mirror with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that looking polished was the first line of defense in maintaining authority. The face looking back at her was carefully composed, makeup that wouldn't smudge during a cross-country flight, hair secured in a regulation bun that would stay perfect through 5 hours of service. The practiced smile that could convey warmth or warning depending on what the situation required. Her phone buzzed. A text from her supervisor, Flight 447 carrying VIP passenger in 2A corporate account. Extra attention to service quality. Patricia scrolled through the passenger manifest on her phone, looking for anything that might signal potential problems. She'd learned to read boarding passes like tea leaves, certain booking patterns, fare classes. Last-minute upgrades often predicted which passengers would demand special treatment, complain about minor issues, or create disruptions that would reflect poorly on her performance reviews. Row 3, Seats C and D last-minute upgrade to first class. Paid tickets, not corporate, not frequent flyer status upgrades. The kind of passengers who might not understand first-class protocols, who might need more guidance about appropriate behavior in the premium cabin. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and headed toward the gate, mentally running through her pre-boarding checklist. The flight was sold out, which meant no empty seats to offer if passengers needed to be relocated, no buffer zones if conflicts arose. Every interaction would need to be managed carefully, efficiently, with the kind of firm politeness that kept situations from escalating. Kevin, the lead flight attendant, was already at the gate counter, reviewing the catering manifest and crew assignments. He looked up as Patricia approached. "Afternoon flight to San Francisco," he said, handing her a service roster. "Pretty routine passenger load. We've got 1 corporate VIP in 2A, otherwise it's mostly business travelers and tourists." Patricia glanced at the list, noting the passengers she'd identified as potential concerns. Any special dietary requests or medical needs? Standard stuff. 2 passengers requested kosher meals, 1 gluten-free, 1 passenger traveling with a service animal in coach. He paused, looking at his tablet. "Oh, and we have passengers in 3C and 3D who upgraded this morning. Keep an eye on them, make sure they understand first-class expectations." The comments sat in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them would have articulated directly. But Patricia understood. Passengers who upgraded last minute, especially passengers who didn't fit the typical first-class demographic, sometimes needed additional guidance about appropriate behavior, about understanding that the premium cabin operated according to certain unstated standards. It wasn't about discrimination, Patricia told herself. It was about maintaining the quality of service that first-class passengers expected. The passengers in first class paid premium prices for an experience that included not just better seats and meals, but a certain ambience, a level of decorum that justified the expense. When passengers who weren't familiar with those expectations entered the space, it could create discomfort for everyone involved. She'd seen it before. Passengers who spoke too loudly on phone calls, who dressed inappropriately for the cabin, who seemed to treat the first-class service as an opportunity to make up for perceived slights, rather than simply enjoying the upgraded experience. It was her job to manage those situations diplomatically, to ensure that all passengers felt comfortable while maintaining the standards that kept the premium service premium. "I'll make sure everyone settles in smoothly," she told Kevin. It was the kind of professional commitment that could mean many things, depending on what the flight required. As they walked toward the jet bridge to begin boarding preparations, Patricia was already planning her approach. She'd greet all passengers warmly, but she'd pay special attention to 3C and 3D, make sure their boarding passes were in order, help them understand any first-class protocols they might not be familiar with. It was just good customer service, really. Proactive problem-solving. She straightened her jacket and prepared to create the kind of smooth, incident-free flight that would reflect well on her performance review, the kind of professional handling that kept passengers satisfied and supervisors happy. The flight would board in 15 minutes. 3 rows back from the unfolding confrontation, Marcus Webb was trying to decide whether to mind his own business. He taught high school history for 37 years before retiring, which meant he developed a finely tuned radar for situations that were about to go sideways. The interaction he was watching between the flight attendant and the 2 young women in row 3 was triggering every classroom management instinct he'd ever developed. Marcus had seen this before, not exactly, but close enough. The way authority figures sometimes approach students they'd already decided were problems, the tone that managed to be polite and suspicious at the same time, the body language that suggested consequences were being considered before any actual infractions had occurred. He pulled his reading glasses down from where they'd been perched on his forehead and looked more carefully at the situation developing ahead of him. The flight attendant, her name tag said Patricia, was examining boarding passes with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspicious documents. The 2 women she was questioning sat with the composed stillness of people who had learned to be very careful about their responses when authority was being exercised against them. Marcus recognized that stillness. He'd seen it in his classroom when certain students were singled out for questioning they didn't deserve, when they understood instinctively that any response they gave might be used as justification for whatever treatment was already being contemplated. His daughter Sarah, who worked as a civil rights attorney in San Jose, had tried to explain to him the concept of microaggressions, the death by 1,000 cuts reality of being subjected to small assumptions and indignities that individually seemed minor but collectively created a constant state of vigilance. Marcus had listened, had thought he understood, but watching this interaction, he was beginning to grasp something he'd only understood intellectually before. The flight attendant was asking questions that seemed reasonable on their surface, about the boarding passes, about the seats, about the nature of their travel, but the questions themselves weren't really the point. The point was the questioning, the assumption that these particular passengers needed to prove their right to be where they were in a way that other passengers didn't. Marcus looked around the first-class cabin. No one else was being asked to verify their seat assignments. No one else was having their boarding passes examined multiple times. The man in 2A, a middle-aged white passenger in an expensive suit, had been offered a pre-departure beverage and asked about his newspaper preference. The couple in 4B had been complimented on their carry-on luggage and informed about the Wi-Fi password. Different passengers, different treatment. Marcus felt his teacher instincts kicking in, the part of him that had spent decades trying to ensure that all students were treated fairly, that had developed a zero-tolerance policy for double standards in his classroom. He reached for his phone, not entirely sure what he intended to do with it. Marcus Webb had never live-streamed anything, barely understood how social media worked, generally preferred to handle problems through proper channels rather than public confrontation. But something about this situation felt like it was moving beyond the realm of problems that proper channels could address. The flight attendant was walking away from row 3 now, moving toward the galley with purposeful strides. She was coming back with backup. Marcus could see it in her posture, in the way she was already scanning the cabin for support, already building her case for whatever escalation she was planning. He opened his phone's camera app and checked the angle. From seat 3F, he had a clear view of row 3 and the aisle where any confrontation would unfold. The lighting was decent, the phone steady in his hands despite the slight tremor that had developed since his last birthday. Marcus Webb had taught teenagers for nearly 4 decades. He knew how quickly situations could spiral out of control when authority was exercised unfairly, when people's dignity was challenged in public, when bystanders chose to look away instead of bearing witness. He wasn't going to look away. Kaya felt the shift in cabin energy before she understood what was happening. She'd been reviewing the partnership documents. Finally, when Patricia returned with Kevin in tow, and something about their approach made her close the folder and give them her full attention. 20 years of navigating predominantly white institutions had taught her to recognize the moment when a situation moved from uncomfortable to potentially dangerous. "Ladies," Patricia said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested this was no longer a request. "I'm going to need to see those boarding passes one more time." Kaya looked at Amara, who had stopped typing and was watching the approaching flight attendants with the careful attention she usually reserved for her camera viewfinder. They'd both learned to read these moments, to recognize when they were being positioned as problems that needed solving. "We've already shown you our boarding passes," Amara said quietly. Her voice was steady, but Kaya could hear the underlying tension, the controlled exhaustion of someone who had hoped to board a plane without becoming a situation. Kevin stepped forward, and Kaya noticed how he positioned himself slightly behind Patricia, close enough to provide backup but far enough to maintain plausible deniability if the interaction went badly. She'd seen this formation before, in law school, in depositions, in courtrooms where opposing counsel wanted to apply pressure without appearing overtly aggressive. "I understand this might seem redundant," Kevin said, his tone suggesting reasonableness while his body language suggested finality. "But we have protocols for ensuring all passengers are properly seated, especially in first class. It's really just a formality." The word "especially" hung in the air, especially in first class, where passengers like them needed additional verification, especially in first class, where their presence required explanation, especially in first class, where the assumption was that they didn't belong. Kaya reached into her purse and pulled out the boarding passes again, handing them over with the measured movements of someone who understood that every gesture was being evaluated for signs of resistance or hostility. She could feel other passengers watching now, the casual conversations and pre-flight activities pausing as people became aware that something was happening in row 3. Patricia examined the boarding passes again, comparing them to some checklist on her phone, taking far more time than the simple verification required. The performance was for the benefit of other passengers as much as it was for them, establishing her authority, demonstrating her thoroughness, creating a record of proper procedure in case justification was needed later. "These seats were upgraded this morning," Patricia said, making it sound like an accusation. "Yes," Kaya replied, We paid for the upgrades. And you're both traveling together. Another obvious question with hidden implications. Were they actually traveling together, or were they individuals who might be separated without disrupting family or business relationships? Were they the kind of passengers whose complaints would be taken seriously, or could they be managed quietly without corporate repercussions? Amara's camera bag was at her feet, and Kaya watched her sister's hand move slowly toward it. Not to grab the camera, that would have been seen as aggressive, but to ground herself on something familiar, something that represented her professional identity and competence. "We're sisters," Amara said. "This is a personal trip." Kevin was scanning the cabin now, making eye contact with other flight attendants, establishing a network of support for whatever was coming next. Kaya recognized the choreography from courtrooms where judges were preparing to make rulings they knew would be controversial. The groundwork being laid, the allies being secured, the narrative being constructed. "I'm going to need to verify these seats with the gate agent," Patricia said, still holding their boarding passes. There might have been an error in the upgrade process. It was a lie, and everyone involved knew it was a lie. But it was the kind of lie that provided cover, that created bureaucratic justification for what was really happening. An error in the upgrade process, a misunderstanding about seat assignments, technical difficulties that just happened to affect these particular passengers. Kaya looked at her watch, not to check the time, but to ground herself in something concrete while she decided how to respond. 20 minutes until scheduled departure. Enough time for this situation to escalate significantly before the plane left the ground. Enough time for whatever was happening to be thoroughly documented by the passengers who were now openly watching the interaction. She could feel her legal training kicking in, the part of her mind that automatically began cataloging details that might be relevant later. The names on the flight attendants' tags, the exact wording of their questions, the presence of other passengers as witnesses, the timeline of events that had led from routine boarding to this moment of scrutiny. But underneath her professional calm, she felt something else rising, the exhaustion of having to prove herself in every space she entered, the frustration of being presumed guilty of some unnamed offense, the anger that came from recognizing a familiar pattern playing out at 30,000 feet. She took a slow breath and made her decision. "Is there a problem with our tickets?" she asked, her voice carrying the tone she used in depositions when she already knew the answer but wanted it on the record. Patricia's grip tightened on the boarding passes. Around them, the first-class cabin had grown quiet, conversations stopping as passengers became aware that they were watching something unfold that would be difficult to explain away as routine airline procedure. Kevin cleared his throat. "We're just trying to ensure everyone has the best possible flight experience. Sometimes seat reassignments are necessary to accommodate all passengers comfortably." Seat reassignments. The euphemism settled over the interaction like a blanket, softening the edges of what was really being proposed. Not removal, not discrimination, not targeting, just reassignments for everyone's comfort. Marcus Webb, 3 rows behind them, pressed record on his phone camera. The decision surprised him. He'd never been the type of person who inserted himself into other people's conflicts, never been comfortable with confrontation or public scenes. But something about this moment felt like a test of character, the kind of situation where silence became complicity. Through his phone screen, he could see the 2 young women sitting with perfect posture, answering questions they shouldn't have been asked, maintaining composure in the face of treatment that would have sent many passengers into angry tirades. He could see the flight attendants building their case with bureaucratic precision, creating paper trails and procedural justifications for decisions that had nothing to do with procedures. And he could see other passengers in first class, watching the scene unfold with expressions that ranged from curiosity to discomfort to approval, but doing nothing to interrupt the process, saying nothing to question the obvious disparity in how different passengers were being treated. Marcus kept recording, 12 minutes to departure. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, cheerful and routine. "Good afternoon, folks. This is Captain Rodriguez speaking. We're just finishing up our pre-flight checks and should be pushing back from the gate in about 10 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." But the cabin wasn't preparing for departure. The cabin was frozen in a tableau of tension, waiting to see how far this would go, how much authority would be exercised, how much dignity would be stripped away before someone said enough. Patricia looked toward the cockpit, then back at the boarding passes in her hand. She had initiated this confrontation, had called for backup, had made it a public spectacle. Now she needed to follow through or find a face-saving way to retreat. She wasn't ready to retreat, not yet. "I'm going to need to ask you both to come with me to speak with the gate agent," she said, her voice loud enough to carry throughout the first-class cabin. "We need to resolve this seating issue before departure." Kaya's hand moved to her phone. Not to make a scene, not to create drama, but to send one simple text message to one specific contact. Because sometimes the most powerful response to an abuse of authority was to ensure that the right person was watching when it happened. She typed, "Flight 447, ATL to SFO, Seat 3C harassment by crew. Please advise." The response came back within 30 seconds. "Document everything. Do not leave your seat. Help is on the way." Kaya put her phone away and looked directly at Patricia. "We're not leaving our seats. If there's a problem with our tickets, you can resolve it right here." The confrontation had officially begun. Security arrived first, 2 airport police officers walking down the jet bridge with the measured pace of people accustomed to dealing with passenger disputes. Patricia had made the call 10 minutes earlier, describing a situation with uncooperative passengers refusing to comply with crew instructions, in language that suggested she was dealing with difficult individuals rather than customers who were questioning obviously discriminatory treatment. Officer Martinez, a 22-year veteran of airport security, had seen versions of this before. Passenger disputes that started over seating or baggage or service issues, but underneath were really about who belonged in certain spaces and who got to make that determination. He'd learned to read these situations carefully, to look for the details that told the real story beyond whatever complaint had brought him onto the aircraft. 10 minutes to departure, the gate agent announced over the intercom, her voice carrying a note of urgency that added pressure to an already tense situation. Martinez surveyed the first-class cabin as he walked toward row 3. Other passengers were sitting quietly, some openly watching the unfolding drama, others pretending to read or work on laptops while clearly listening to every word. The 2 young black women in row 3 sat with the kind of composed stillness that he recognized from people who had learned to be very careful about their reactions when confronted by authority. Behind him, Marcus Webb was still recording, his phone camera capturing everything with the steady hands of someone who understood the importance of documentation. Marcus had already made a decision that surprised him. When this was over, whatever the outcome, he wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened. "Good afternoon," Martinez said, positioning himself where both the flight attendants and the passengers could see him clearly. "I understand there's some confusion about seating arrangements." Patricia stepped forward, her posture suggesting she was grateful for official backup. "These passengers are refusing to cooperate with our seating protocols. We've asked them to speak with the gate agent about their upgrade, and they're refusing to leave their seats." Kaya looked at the security officer with the measured attention she gave to judges when they were about to make rulings that could affect her clients' lives. "Officer, we've shown our boarding passes multiple times. We purchased these seats, we're sitting in our assigned seats, and we haven't violated any airline policies. We'd like to know specifically what rule we're accused of breaking." It was the right question, asked in the right tone. Martinez had dealt with genuinely uncooperative passengers, people who were intoxicated or belligerent or actually violating federal regulations. The woman asking him this question was none of those things. She was someone who understood how authority worked and was asking him to justify its exercise. 8 minutes to departure, came the announcement. The countdown was becoming a drumbeat, adding urgency to a situation that was attracting more attention with every passing minute. Behind the security officers, Captain Rodriguez appeared at the front of the cabin, drawn out of the cockpit by reports of a passenger issue that was delaying departure. He was a 15-year veteran pilot who had learned that most passenger disputes could be resolved quickly with the right application of authority and common sense. But as he walked toward row 3, taking in the scene, 2 composed black women surrounded by white flight attendants and security officers, other passengers watching with expressions ranging from discomfort to interest, phone cameras that were definitely recording. He felt his stomach tighten with recognition. This wasn't a passenger dispute. This was something that could end careers and cost the airline millions of dollars if it wasn't handled perfectly. And from what he could see, it was already well past the point where perfect handling was possible. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was ultimately responsible for everything that happened on his aircraft. Patricia began to repeat her explanation about seating protocols and passenger cooperation, but Captain Rodriguez was already reading the situation differently than she was. He could see the phones recording, could imagine the social media posts and news stories that were probably already being composed, could visualize the corporate crisis management meetings that would be happening within hours if this continued to escalate. Marcus Webb's phone showed 3,247 people watching his live stream. The viewer count had been climbing steadily as word spread across social media that something was happening on Delta Flight 447. Comments were flooding in faster than he could read them, but the ones he caught were uniformly outraged, demanding action, asking for flight numbers and crew names. 6 minutes to departure. All passengers should be seated with seatbelts fastened. The irony of the announcement wasn't lost on anyone. All passengers should be seated, but 2 passengers were being asked to unseat themselves to resolve a problem that existed only in the minds of the crew members who had created it. Amara spoke for the first time since the security officers had boarded. "Captain, we would like to know what specific airline policy we've violated that justifies this treatment. We've been polite, we've answered questions, we've shown our boarding passes multiple times. We're sitting in seats we paid for. What exactly is the problem?" It was a simple question that cut through all the bureaucratic language and procedural justifications to the heart of what was really happening. Captain Rodriguez looked at the boarding passes Patricia was still holding, looked at the passengers who were clearly exactly where they were supposed to be, looked at the phones recording every word of his response. His radio crackled. "Flight 447, this is ground control. We show you ready for pushback, but you're still at the gate. What's your status?" "Ground control, stand by. We're resolving a passenger issue." But even as he said it, Captain Rodriguez was beginning to understand that this wasn't a passenger issue at all. This was a crew issue, a judgment issue, a situation that had been created and escalated by his own flight attendants, and was now being documented in real time by passengers who understood exactly what they were witnessing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Delta Operations, Flight 447 trending on social media, corporate monitoring situation, need immediate resolution. Captain Rodriguez felt the ground shifting beneath him. This wasn't just about 2 passengers and their seat assignments anymore. This was about corporate liability, federal discrimination laws, viral videos, and career-ending decisions that had already been made and couldn't be unmade. He looked at Patricia, who was still waiting for him to support her authority, still expecting him to back up the confrontation she had initiated. Then he looked at the two women in row 3, who were watching him with the patient attention of people who had learned to wait quietly while their fate was decided by others. 4 minutes to departure. Final boarding call for Flight 447. The countdown continued, but Captain Rodriguez was no longer thinking about departure times. He was thinking about phone calls he was going to have to make, explanations he was going to have to give, and decisions he needed to make in the next 60 seconds that would determine whether this situation ended with apologies or lawsuits. His phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID showed a name that made his hands go cold: FAA Regional Administrator. Patricia Chen felt it before she understood it. The ground was shifting. The FAA Administrator's call lasted exactly 47 seconds. Captain Rodriguez took it standing in the galley area, his face growing paler with each word from the other end. When he hung up, he stood motionless for a moment, staring at his phone as if it contained information he couldn't quite process. Marcus Webb's livestream had reached 47,000 viewers. The comments were coming so fast they were just a blur of outrage, but the message was clear. People were watching, people were angry, and people were taking action. Someone had posted Delta's customer service number. Someone else had tagged the Department of Transportation. The hashtag #Delta discrimination was already trending. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying across the first-class cabin with careful authority, "I apologize for the delay. We're going to resolve this situation immediately and get underway." He walked directly to row 3, past the security officers, past Patricia and Kevin, and addressed Kaya and Amara directly. "I sincerely apologize for this inconvenience," he said, his voice formal but unmistakably genuine. "There has been a misunderstanding about your seating, and I want to make it clear that you are exactly where you should be. Your seats are confirmed, your boarding passes are valid, and there are no issues with your travel today." Patricia started to speak, but Captain Rodriguez continued without pausing. "Officer Martinez, thank you for responding, but your services won't be needed. This was a crew error and we'll handle it internally." The security officers looked confused but relieved. Passenger disputes were always messy, but disputes that involved potential discrimination were career hazards for everyone involved. They nodded to the captain and began making their way back up the aisle toward the exit. "Flight attendants," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin, "please take your positions for departure. All passengers are properly seated." But Patricia wasn't ready to let it go. She'd initiated this confrontation, had called security, had made it a public spectacle in front of dozens of witnesses. Backing down now felt like admitting she'd been wrong from the beginning, like accepting that her judgment and authority meant nothing. "Captain," she said, her voice tight with controlled frustration, "I was following standard protocol for verifying passenger credentials. These passengers were upgraded this morning, and I was confirming." "Ms. Chen," the captain's voice cut through her explanation with surgical precision, "please report to the galley, now." The tone left no room for argument. Patricia looked around the cabin, at the passengers watching with undisguised interest, at Kevin, who was avoiding eye contact, at the two women in row 3 who were sitting quietly, waiting to see how this would end. She walked toward the galley, her face burning with embarrassment and anger. Behind her, she could hear Captain Rodriguez continuing to speak to the passengers, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that suggested this situation was now completely under control. "Ladies, again, I apologize for the disruption. Is there anything we can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable?" Kaya looked at Amara, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. They'd won this confrontation, but winning felt exhausting rather than satisfying. They'd proven they belonged in seats they'd already paid for, established their right to occupy space, They'd never been trying to take illegally, defended themselves against accusations that should never have been made. "We're fine," Kaya said quietly. "Thank you." Captain Rodriguez nodded and moved toward the galley, where Patricia was waiting with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that this day was going to end very differently than it had begun. In the galley, the conversation was brief and decisive. Corporate had been clear. The crew members involved in the incident were to be removed from the flight immediately. An investigation would begin as soon as the plane reached San Francisco. Pending that investigation, Patricia and Kevin would be suspended without pay. "This isn't fair," Patricia said, her voice breaking slightly. "I was following protocol. I was trying to maintain standards." Captain Rodriguez looked at her with something that might have been sympathy, but his voice remained professional. "Ms. Chen, you targeted 2 passengers for additional scrutiny based on criteria that had nothing to do with airline policy or safety. You escalated a non-existent problem into a federal discrimination incident that's now being watched by 50,000 people on social media. There's going to be an investigation, there are going to be lawsuits, and there are going to be consequences." He paused, looking out at the cabin where passengers were beginning to settle back into their seats, where normal pre-flight activities were slowly resuming. "You need to gather your things and deplane. A replacement crew is being called in." Patricia looked out at the cabin one more time, seeing it differently now. The 2 women in row 3 were opening books and laptops, returning to the quiet activities of passengers preparing for a routine flight. Other travelers were checking phones, ordering drinks, engaging in the casual conversations that filled first-class cabins. It looked exactly like it had looked an hour ago, when she'd first walked down this aisle and decided that something was wrong that needed fixing. But nothing had been wrong. Nothing had needed fixing. The only problem had been her assumption that passengers who looked like these passengers needed additional verification to justify their presence in this space. She walked back toward the jet bridge, carrying her crew bag and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Behind her, the boarding door closed and Delta Flight 447 began its preparation for departure, delayed by 43 minutes due to what the official incident report would describe as crew-related service issues. Marcus Webb ended his live stream as the plane pulled back from the gate. 58,000 people had watched the entire confrontation unfold, had witnessed the escalation and the eventual resolution, had seen how quickly authority could be exercised, and how dramatically it could be challenged when enough people were paying attention. In row 3, Kaya and Amara settled into their seats for the flight to San Francisco. They didn't talk about what had happened. There would be time for that later, time for processing and analysis and discussion about patterns they'd seen before and would probably see again. For now, they were simply passengers on a plane, traveling to see a friend, carrying the same hopes and plans and normal human concerns that filled the thoughts of everyone else in the cabin. The plane climbed into the afternoon sky, carrying its passengers toward their destinations and away from a confrontation that would become a case study in corporate crisis management, unconscious bias training, and the power of social media to transform individual incidents into moments of broader reckoning. But that was still to come. For now, there was just the quiet hum of engines and the sense of forward motion, carrying everyone involved toward whatever consequences and changes in conversations would emerge from the choices made on the ground. The flight continued. 2 hours into the flight, a passenger in first class approached Kaya and Amara with something unexpected, a business card. "I couldn't help but overhear what happened during boarding," the woman said quietly. She was older, maybe 60, with the kind of understated jewelry that suggested old money rather than new success. "I wanted you to have this." The card was simple, cream-colored stock with raised lettering. Kaya glanced at it and felt something shift in her chest. Board member, Delta Airlines Executive Committee. The woman's name was Helen Morrison. "You're on the board?" Kaya asked, keeping her voice low. "I am, and what happened to you today was unacceptable." Helen Morrison's voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to. "There will be consequences." Word traveled quickly through the cabin in the way that important information always does on airplanes. Whispered conversations, subtle glances, the gradual awareness that something significant had just occurred. By the time they landed in San Francisco, several passengers knew that Patricia Walsh had just spent 3 hours on a flight where one of her targets was connected to the airline's corporate leadership. Patricia herself learned this during deplaning, when the gate agent handed her a message to report immediately to the airport's operations center. She walked through the terminal carrying her crew bag, and a growing sense that her 43-minute delay was going to cost more than schedule adjustments and passenger complaints. The silence in the cabin stretched long. Someone's phone buzzed. A child coughed twice, then settled back into sleep. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but this time the announcement wasn't for passengers. "This is Captain Rodriguez. I've just received confirmation from Atlanta headquarters regarding the passengers in row 3. His voice carried the formal tone reserved for official communications, but there was something else underneath it, a kind of careful precision that suggested he was choosing each word deliberately. "I'm advised that Ms. Kaya Thompson is the chairman and CEO of Thompson Industries, one of Delta's largest corporate accounts, representing approximately $12 million in annual travel contracts." The silence that followed wasn't just absence of sound. It was the kind of quiet that occurs when everyone in a space simultaneously realizes they've witnessed something that cannot be undone. Patricia's face drained of color from the forehead down, leaving her complexion the shade of chalk. Her hands, which had moved so confidently when directing passengers and checking documentation, now trembled as they gripped the galley counter. The confident posture that had carried her through the boarding process collapsed as she leaned against the wall, her legs suddenly unreliable. "Furthermore," Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "Ms. Thompson sits on Delta's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee and has been instrumental in developing our current passenger experience protocols. She was traveling to San Francisco for tomorrow's quarterly board meeting where passenger service standards were scheduled for review." Patricia's breath came in short, shallow draws. Her supervisor's words from the jet bridge echoed differently now, not just about policy violations and social media attention, but about the kind of mistake that ends careers and creates corporate crises. The uniform she'd worn with such authority felt heavy, foreign, like a costume she'd never been meant to wear. The weight of realization settled over the cabin like pressure from a storm front. This hadn't been a flight attendant making difficult but necessary decisions. This had been a systematic targeting of passengers based on assumptions that had no connection to reality, capability, or belonging. And that's when Patricia Walsh finally understood, not just what she had done, what she had done to. The immediate aftermath unfolded in 3 distinct ways, each revealing a different aspect of what had just occurred. For Patricia Walsh, the realization didn't bring instant collapse. There was still a part of her that sought to salvage something from the situation. "I was just following protocol," she said quietly to her supervisor, who had remained on the flight to observe the conclusion. "The seating looked irregular, and I thought." But the words fell away as she spoke them, each justification revealing itself as inadequate. The protocol she referenced didn't exist. The irregularity she'd noticed was based entirely on her assumptions about who belonged in first-class seating. The professional instincts she'd trusted had been nothing more than biases dressed up as policy. The silence that followed was complete. For the other passengers, the revelation created a different kind of reckoning. The man in seat 1C who had nodded approvingly when Patricia first approached row 3 now studied his phone screen with intense focus, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His earlier satisfaction at seeing proper standards maintained had transformed into the uncomfortable awareness that he'd been complicit in something ugly. The woman in 2A, who had whispered to her companion about finally seeing someone with standards on airlines, now gripped her purse handle with white knuckles. Her comment, made quietly but not quietly enough, hung in the air like evidence of her participation in the moment's assumptions. Others who had simply watched without comment faced their own reckonings. The businessman who had glanced up from his laptop with curiosity rather than concern. The couple who had exchanged looks that suggested they were witnessing something deserved rather than something wrong. The passengers who had turned away, choosing not to see what was happening 3 rows behind them. Their silence, they realized, had been a form of participation. Their failure to question what they were witnessing had allowed the incident to escalate. The comfortable assumption that airline staff must have valid reasons for their actions had enabled a confrontation that should never have occurred. For Kaya and Amara, the revelation brought no sense of victory or vindication. They exchanged a look that contained years of similar moments. The hotel desk clerk who insisted on seeing credit cards twice, the restaurant host who claimed their reservation couldn't be found, the retail employee who followed them through stores with offers to help that felt more like surveillance. "How many times do you think we've had to prove we belong somewhere?" Amara asked quietly. Kaya considered the question. "I stopped counting after college." There was weariness in their voices, the familiar exhaustion of people who had learned to carry documentation of their legitimacy, business cards, credentials, references, because their presence in certain spaces would inevitably be questioned. The irony wasn't lost on them that Kaya's corporate position with the airline had been the factor that finally ended the confrontation, rather than the simple principle that passengers shouldn't be harassed based on their appearance. This wasn't victory. This was just another Tuesday. The only difference was that this time someone had been recording. The real consequences began accumulating before the plane reached cruising altitude. Marcus Webb's livestream had peaked at 58,000 concurrent viewers by the time Captain Rodriguez made his announcement. Within 6 hours of landing, edited clips of the confrontation had generated 1.2 million views across social media platforms. The numbers translated into immediate financial impact. Delta's stock price dropped 4% in after-hours trading, wiping out $847 million in market capitalization. That was enough money to buy every passenger in that first-class cabin a house. Gone in the time it took for one flight attendant to make assumptions about who deserved to sit where. The airline's crisis management team worked through the night, but the damage assessment revealed the scope of what Patricia Walsh's 43-minute delay had actually cost. Delta faced 17 pending discrimination complaints already working their way through legal channels, cases that would now receive renewed media attention and scrutiny. The company's legal department projected lawsuit settlements and legal fees reaching $12 million, coincidentally the same amount as Kaya's annual corporate travel contract. Patricia Walsh's termination was announced 8 hours after landing, but her firing was only one line item in a larger reckoning. Her supervisor, who had initially supported her actions, received a 60-day suspension without pay pending completion of bias training and evaluation. The gate agent who had processed the boarding passes without question faced mandatory retraining. Even the ground crew supervisor who had been present during the initial confrontation received documentation in his personnel file. The airline allocated $4 million for crisis public relations management, hiring consultants, producing response videos, and implementing immediate policy changes. Another $6 million went toward expedited diversity training for all customer-facing staff. The total cost of one flight attendant's assumptions, $31 million in the first quarter alone. Marcus Webb's follower count increased by 43,000 in the week following his livestream. The attention transformed him from a casual travel blogger into an accidental advocate, though the role came with complications he hadn't anticipated. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and invitations to discuss airline discrimination on news programs. The viral moment had changed his life in ways he was still processing. But the financial numbers, significant as they were, represented only the visible consequences of the incident. The system-level changes revealed the true scope of what had occurred on Flight 447. The emergency board meeting convened at Delta's Atlanta headquarters 18 hours after the incident concluded. The conference room on the 42nd floor normally hosted quarterly reviews and strategic planning sessions, but the atmosphere that morning carried the tension of crisis management. Executives who had been preparing for routine business discussions found themselves crafting responses to a discrimination incident that had become national news. The meeting lasted 4 hours and resulted in immediate policy changes that went far beyond standard corporate damage control. Every customer service interaction involving seating disputes would now require supervisor approval before passengers could be asked to move. Flight attendants would receive body cameras to document any confrontations, with footage subject to third-party review in cases involving discrimination complaints. Most significantly, the airline announced a zero-tolerance policy for assumption-based passenger targeting, with immediate termination for any employee found to have confronted passengers based on appearance rather than documented policy violations. The new protocols required specific, articulable reasons for any passenger interaction beyond standard service. The ripple effects extended throughout the industry within 72 hours. American Airlines issued a statement reaffirming their commitment to passenger dignity and announced expanded bias training for all staff. United Airlines accelerated the rollout of their diversity initiative, moving the timeline up by 6 months. Southwest Airlines quietly updated their employee handbook to include specific language about seating disputes and passenger profiling. The responses weren't entirely voluntary. Consumer advocacy groups had seized on the incident to highlight patterns of discrimination across the airline industry, submitting formal complaints to the Department of Transportation and demanding federal oversight of passenger treatment policies. The political pressure created an environment where airlines needed to demonstrate proactive change rather than reactive compliance. 3 weeks after the incident, Kaya received an invitation to address the industry's Passenger Experience Council, a consortium of airline executives, consumer advocates, and federal regulators who were developing new standards for customer service interactions. The invitation came through official channels, acknowledging her role not just as a passenger who had been mistreated, but as someone whose corporate position gave her insights into both sides of the airline business relationship. She declined the media interviews but accepted the policy meeting. The session took place in a Washington, D.C. conference room with 47 industry representatives, and Kaya's presentation focused not on her personal experience but on the systemic assumptions that had created the conditions for the confrontation. The issue wasn't one flight attendant making a bad decision, she told the room. The issue was the absence of systems that would have prevented that decision from being possible. When employees are trained to identify problems but not trained to examine their own assumptions about what problems look like, incidents like this become inevitable. Her recommendations included mandatory de-escalation training, supervisor oversight for passenger disputes, and regular review of complaint patterns to identify employees whose interactions consistently involved passengers of color. The presentation lasted 22 minutes and resulted in policy recommendations that were implemented across 6 major carriers within 4 months. The changes didn't emerge from corporate goodwill or sudden enlightenment about discrimination. They emerged from the recognition that assumptions about passengers could cost millions of dollars and create federal regulatory attention that no airline wanted to navigate. 6 months after Flight 447, Marcus Webb was still processing what his decision to livestream had set in motion. His follower count had stabilized at 200,000, and brands were reaching out about partnership opportunities, but the attention felt complicated in ways he hadn't expected. People recognized him in airports now, approaching with thanks for documenting the incident or curiosity about what he'd witnessed. The recognition was flattering, but it also served as a constant reminder of why his documentation had been necessary in the first place. He had become known for recording discrimination rather than for travel advice or entertainment content. The weight of that responsibility was something he thought about often during flights. His phone was always charged now, his recording app easily accessible, because the incident on Flight 447 had shown him how quickly situations could escalate and how important documentation could be for passengers who might not be believed without video evidence. He still flew Delta. The airline had implemented changes that impressed him, and he appreciated their response to the incident. But he kept his phone charged and his camera ready, because the changes in policy didn't necessarily mean changes in individual assumptions and behaviors. She still flew that airline. She just kept her phone charged, just in case. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today was not extraordinary. That's the point. The confrontation on Flight 447 represented something that happens far more frequently than most people realize, but usually without cameras recording, and without the particular circumstances that led to consequences and changes. The system of assumptions that Patricia Walsh acted upon, beliefs about who belongs in first-class cabins, who needs additional verification of their legitimacy, whose presence in certain spaces requires explanation, operates quietly in countless interactions every day. The difference wasn't that discrimination suddenly appeared on one flight. The difference was that this time, someone was recording, someone with influence was targeted, and enough people were watching to make silence impossible. Patricia Walsh wasn't an unusually prejudiced person or a deliberately cruel employee. She was someone operating within assumptions that our society has taught her to see as normal and reasonable. The tragedy wasn't that she held these assumptions. It was that the systems around her had never required her to examine them or provided tools to recognize when they were driving her decisions. What about the other passengers who watched the confrontation unfold? The man who nodded approvingly when Patricia first approached row 3 wasn't evil, but his approval enabled the escalation. The woman who whispered about standards wasn't trying to cause harm, but her comment reinforced the idea that the confrontation was justified. The passengers who looked away weren't necessarily endorsing discrimination, but their silence allowed it to continue. What would you have done? It's easy to imagine ourselves as Marcus Webb, documenting injustice and speaking up for what's right. It's harder to acknowledge that most of us have been the passenger looking away, hoping someone else would handle a situation that made us uncomfortable. The difference between Marcus Webb and everyone else wasn't courage, though courage was required. The difference was the decision to stop waiting for someone else to act first. 1 year later, the changes initiated by the Flight 447 incident had become standard practice across the industry. Passenger advocacy groups reported a 37% decrease in discrimination complaints related to seating disputes. The body camera pilot program had expanded to 12 airlines, with footage review helping to resolve conflicts before they escalated to federal complaints. The industry-wide policy changes had created new employment opportunities as well. Airlines hired bias trainers, customer experience auditors, and passenger advocacy coordinators, jobs that existed because companies had recognized that preventing discrimination incidents was more cost-effective than managing their aftermath. The Thompson Industries corporate travel account remained with Delta, and Kaya's feedback during quarterly reviews had influenced service training across the airline's domestic routes. Her recommendations weren't based on her personal experience, but on systematic analysis of passenger complaint patterns and employee interaction data. The business relationship had evolved beyond the incident that initially brought attention to passenger treatment issues. Patricia Walsh had found employment with a regional airline, but only after completing a comprehensive bias training program and demonstrating sustained behavior change through a 6-month probationary period. Her termination from Delta had made her unemployable at major carriers, but smaller airlines were willing to provide second chances with appropriate safeguards and ongoing monitoring. The most significant change was the one that received the least attention: the thousands of routine passenger interactions that now proceeded without incident, because employees had been trained to recognize their assumptions and passengers felt confident that discriminatory treatment would be documented and addressed. Kaya Thompson boarded a flight last Thursday, first class. Nobody asked her twice. Have you ever witnessed something like this and wished you'd said something? I want to hear about it in the comments, because these stories matter more than we usually acknowledge. The moments when we choose to speak up or stay silent shape the experiences of everyone around us, and understanding our own responses to injustice is the first step toward changing systems that allow it to continue. The stories that make the biggest difference aren't always the ones that make headlines or go viral on social media. Sometimes they're the quiet confrontations that happen when someone decides to ask questions instead of making assumptions, or when a bystander chooses to pay attention instead of looking away. If you believe that these smaller moments of accountability matter just as much as the dramatic ones, this channel is for you. Share this story with someone who needs to see it, but not to make them angry or upset. Share it to remind them what quiet power looks like when it's combined with the willingness to act. The most important changes often begin with individual decisions to stop waiting for someone else to step forward first, and every person who watches this video has opportunities to make those decisions in their own daily interactions and observations. The flight continues, and so do we. The question is whether we're paying attention to where we're going and who's traveling with us.